Before we move forward, please like, share, and subscribe Strategic Vanguard and be up to date with the latest news and happenings from the world of defense, strategic, and international affairs. Tune into our video channels in YouTube and Rumble. And if you want to hear the audio version, tune into our Strategic Vanguard channels in Spotify and Amazon Music.
Okay, let's start with a basic question. Who fights wars? For most of history, you'd probably say states, kings, empires. Their official armies. But that line is getting really, really blurry now. Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to give you a shortcut to understanding something called private military companies, or PMCs. And these aren't just like random mercenaries. They are complex corporations. And they're seriously reshaping conflict and global politics right now. So our mission today is basically to unpack how these, powerful but kind of ambiguous players work. We'll look into their history, which is actually pretty fascinating, examine what they're doing globally today. We'll definitely touch on the sticky legal and ethical issues they bring up, and maybe even think about what this all means for countries like India. We'll look at some really interesting examples, too. You maybe heard of Blackwater in Iraq?
Oh, yeah. Definitely notorious.
Right. And then there's Russia's Wagner Group all over Ukraine and Africa, plus Chinese firms protecting huge infrastructure projects overseas. It's a huge, sometimes hidden world. And this deep dive, it forces you to ask some big questions. Like, who is actually accountable when contractors do terrible things? Are we outsourcing war beyond any real democratic control?
That's a critical one.
And how do these PMCs shift power between countries, especially in, unstable places? Let's dive in. So this whole idea of hired guns, and it's not exactly new, is it? What makes today's PMCs different from, say, mercenaries back in the day?
That's really the core of it, yeah. And the difference is pretty profound, actually. I mean, fighting for pay, that's ancient. Think about the Greek city-states hiring hoplites, or Carthage using mercenaries against Rome in the Punic Wars. It goes way back. And you had the Italian condottieri, right? Those powerful mercenary captains in the Renaissance selling their services to different cities. Even look at the colonial era. The East India Company is a really interesting parallel. It wasn't just trade. They had a massive private army, bigger than the British Crown's army at one point. That's how they conquered and ran India until, 1858. So yeah, private groups in war, not new. But the key thing, the real insight for today's PMCs is their corporatization and their globalization. Unlike, freelance soldiers just looking for a fight, modern PMCs are actual incorporated businesses. They have HQs, proper legal contracts, complex recruitment networks. They run like multinational corporations just in the security and military sphere. That's the big shift.
Okay, so they became corporations. But what really kicked off their rise in, say, the last few decades? What specific global events pushed them into the spotlight?
Right. So their big acceleration came after the Cold War. It was like a perfect storm, really. Three main things happened. First, you suddenly had this huge surplus of trained soldiers. When the Cold War ended, militaries in the US, UK, Russia, South Africa, they all downsized massively. Thousands of skilled soldiers needed jobs.
Right, a supply of talent.
Exactly. Second, there was a huge spike in demand. The end of the Cold War didn't mean peace everywhere. Instead, you got all these conflicts popping up in Africa, the Balkans, the Middle East, and they needed security expertise that governments either couldn't or maybe wouldn't provide themselves. And the third piece, really critical, was the rise of neoliberal economics. This whole idea of privatization, market solutions, government started outsourcing everything, and while the military wasn't off limits, PMCs started looking like a cost-effective way to get security or military tasks done, without the political baggage or long-term costs of using official troops.
Cost-effective, maybe, but with other costs.
For sure. And the striking thing is how far it went. By the early 2000s, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. was relying so heavily on contractors that at times, these private personnel actually outnumbered the uniformed U.S. military troops on the ground. Think about that. War had been, partly privatized.
Wow. Okay, let's make this more concrete. Let's dive into some specific examples of these PMCs in action, because the stories really show you their impact and variety. Let's start with maybe the most famous or infamous American one, Blackwater. What's their deal?
Blackwater, yeah. Founded in 1997 by a former Navy SEAL, Eric Prince. They really blew up during the Iraq War. Got billions, literally billions in U.S. government contracts, mostly for security details, protecting officials, that kind of thing. But they became infamous, really, after the Nisaar Square massacre in Baghdad in 2007.
I remember that. Terrible incident.
Absolutely. Their contractors opened fire in a crowded square, killed 17 Iraqi civilians. And what's crucial here, the big takeaway from the Blackwater story, is how it just starkly exposed this massive accountability gap. These contractors were operating in a kind of legal limbo. Were they subject to military law, international law, Iraqi law? It was incredibly unclear.
So when things went horribly wrong, it was hard to hold anyone truly responsible. A powerful cautionary tale, definitely.
Precisely. It showed the dark side of outsourcing violence.
Okay, let's shift gears. Russia's Wagner Group. They feel like a different beast altogether, right? More like a direct tool of the state.
Very different model, yes. Wagner really shows the PMC as a geopolitical instrument. It's closely tied to the Kremlin, even if Moscow denies it sometimes. They've been everywhere. Active in Ukraine since 2014, in Crimea and the Donbass, propping up Assad in Syria, and huge operations across Africa, Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, Libya, the list goes on. And here's the key insight with Wagner. Their role often goes way beyond just fighting or security. It bleeds into resource extraction and political influence.
How so?
Well, in exchange for sending fighters or providing security for regimes, Wagner-linked companies often get awarded lucrative deals. Mining concessions for gold or diamonds, oil access, infrastructure contracts. They're essentially building these self-funding shadow networks. It's military power mixed directly with economic exploitation.
So Moscow gets influence, resources, and crucially, plausible deniability.
Exactly that. Plausible deniability is huge. Moscow can project power, intervene in conflicts, challenge Western influence, all without officially sending the Russian army. It avoids casualties among regular troops, avoids international sanctions sometimes, avoids domestic scrutiny.
But that model has risks too, doesn't it? Having these semi-independent armed groups running around.
Oh, absolutely. The danger became incredibly clear with that Wagner mutiny in 2023, right? Marching towards Moscow. It was a dramatic reminder that even a tool you think you control can turn against you, creates massive instability.
Yeah. That sounds it. Okay, moving east now. What about Chinese PMCs? We care less about them, but China's global footprint is massive with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, and that's exactly why they've emerged. China has trillions invested overseas through BRI, often in very unstable regions across Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East. Their companies, their workers, they face real security risks. So a domestic PMC sector had to develop to meet that need. You have firms like Frontier Services Group, interestingly, also founded by Eric Prince after he left Blackwater.
And we have the same guy?
The very same. Shows how global this industry is. But the key difference, for now at least, with Chinese PMCs is their posture. They're generally much more defensive. Their main job is protecting Chinese assets, pipelines, mines, construction sites, and personnel. Risk management, site security. It's usually not about direct combat or offensive operations like you saw with Blackwater or especially Wagner.
More guards than shock troops, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. But you have to wonder, as China's global power and ambitions grow, will that line hold?
Right. The line between protecting assets and, say, intervening more forcefully could get blurry pretty fast. Okay, so these examples, Blackwater's accountability issues, Wagner's geopolitical games, China's defensive security, they really highlight some deeply uncomfortable questions, don't they, for all of us?
They absolutely do. And the central problem, the one that keeps coming up, is accountability. International law just hasn't kept pace. The Geneva Conventions, they were written for states and their regular armies, not for corporations employing fighters. There's the UN Mercenary Convention from 1989, which tries to outlaw mercenaries, but most major countries, including the ones using TMCs heavily, never signed it. So it lacks teeth.
So a big legal void.
Huge one. And then there's domestic law. Contractors often fall between the cracks. Is the law of their home country applicable? The country where they're operating, it's often unclear. And critically, this lack of clear legal footing allows governments to bypass democratic oversight. It's easier politically to send contractors than to get parliamentary or congressional approval to deploy official troops. Less public debate, less scrutiny.
Which leads us straight to the core ethical question, doesn't it? Should war, maybe the most serious thing a state can do, should that even be outsourced to private companies driven by profit?
That's the fundamental dilemma. And when you connect these challenges, the wider impacts become clear. Human rights abuses are a serious risk. When oversight is weak and profit is a motive, terrible things can happen, and often perpetrators face no consequences. This just breeds more instability. And geopolitically, PMCs are now definite tools in the great power competition toolkit. Russia uses Wagner to push back against the West. China uses its PMCs to secure the BRI. The U.S. has integrated contractors deeply into its military operations for decades.
They're changing how states project power.
Absolutely. And in fragile states, it's complicated. Sometimes PMCs fill a genuine security vacuum, but other times, they just prop up authoritarian regimes, providing them with loyal forces outside the national army. And don't forget the resource angle. Often the payment for PMC services isn't just cash, it's access to mines, oil fields, gas reserves. Conflict gets directly tied to economic exploitation. It all feeds into this idea of hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict. PMCs let states operate below the radar, below the threshold of declared war. They offer deniability, flexibility, and expendability.
Okay, let's bring this closer to home for some listeners. What does all this mean for a country like India? Is New Delhi thinking about getting into the PMC game?
India's situation is pretty different right now. They don't really have PMCs in the mold of Blackwater or Wagner. Not yet, anyway. What India does have is a gigantic private security industry. Over 9 million people, apparently. But they're mostly unarmed guards doing domestic security guarding, buildings, ATMs, that kind of thing. There are some smaller companies, often run by ex-military officers, that do provide services like risk consulting, training, maybe some overseas security for Indian companies. Kind of the beginnings, perhaps.
But not state-backed armed groups operating abroad.
Not in the same way, no. But India's interests are expanding globally. Significantly.
Right. You've got energy projects in Africa, the Middle East, a huge Indian diaspora, millions of people living and working in potentially unstable regions. Plus, growing strategic competition with China across the Indian Ocean in Africa. So it definitely raises the question, should India develop its own, maybe regulated PMCs to protect those interests? What are the arguments for and against?
It's a major strategic crossroads for India, really. There are strong arguments for developing some kind of PMC capability. They could potentially protect Indian investments and citizens overseas without deploying the actual Indian army, which is always politically sensitive and a big commitment. India could also offer security services to friendly countries as part of its diplomatic strategy, building partnerships. And of course, it could create jobs for India's very large number of military veterans. That's a significant factor.
Okay, those are compelling points, but what about the downsides?
The arguments against are just as serious, and they echo the problems we've seen elsewhere. First, the risk of human rights abuses is huge. Any incident involving an Indian-linked PMC could badly damage India's international reputation and its soft power. Then there are the oversight and accountability challenges we've discussed. How do you effectively control these groups operating far from home? It's incredibly difficult. And finally, using PMCs could clash with India's traditional foreign policy stance of non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs. It could be seen as meddling.
So it's a real balancing act. If India ever goes down this road, it seems crucial they need to study what others have done, learn the lessons, and build a really strong, unique legal framework first.
Absolutely critical. It can't be an afterthought.
Okay, looking ahead then, what's the general forecast for PMCs globally? Are we going to see more of them, less of them? Where are things headed?
Well, pretty much all signs point towards further expansion, not contraction. It seems unlikely this trend will reverse. One big area is technology integration. We're already seeing the outsourcing of things like drone operations, cyber warfare capabilities, AI-driven surveillance. Private firms often have specialized skills states lack or find easier to contract out.
So PMCs moving into high-tech warfare too.
Definitely. And another possibility is the rise of what you might call corporate wars. As big multinational companies compete harder for resources, minerals, water, land, especially in unstable regions, they might start relying more on their own contracted PMCs for security and leverage, rather than just relying on host states or their home governments.
Companies fighting proxy battles through PMCs.
It's a potential future, yeah. And shadow wars, gray zone conflicts. PMCs will likely remain key players there, providing that crucial deniability for states. And we might see new players emerge too. It won't just be the US, Russia, China. More middle power countries might start experimenting with PMCs as a tool for projecting influence abroad without the full cost and commitment of using their national militaries.
So the bottom line is, the privatization of war, or aspects of it, seems set to be a really defining feature of international politics in the 21st century.
It certainly looks that way.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. As we've heard, private military companies are absolutely not fringe players anymore. They are deeply involved in shaping wars, supporting regimes, securing vital resources, and fundamentally changing the global power balance right under our noses. For democracies like ours, they raise really tough, uncomfortable questions about accountability, about ethics, about who controls the use of force, questions you, as a citizen, really need to grapple with.
And for authoritarian states, they're clearly very useful, offering ways to exert influence while denying responsibility.
And for fragile states caught in the middle, PMCs might offer a quick security fix, but often, as we've seen, the long-term costs in terms of stability, human rights, sovereignty can be incredibly high. So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Consider how this rise of PMCs really blurs the lines between war and business, between state action and private action. What does it actually mean for your understanding of global security when that distinction becomes so fuzzy? How undeniability is too much? For a government, for a company, and maybe most fundamentally, what kind of world are we creating when war itself or the tools of war become just another commodity to be bought and sold on the global market? We really encourage you to keep thinking about these implications because as this deep dive shows, ignoring the rise of private military companies, that's just not an option anymore.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.